So which Space Marine units do you think are strongest and weakest in the new Codex? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In this video I'm going to try and roughly rank the Space Marine units in terms of power, starting with some of the weaker units in the Codex, and then moving on to the units that I think are strongest. For this comparison I have decided to leave out characters. I think they really deserve a system of their own, to be honest, as it's kind of hard to weigh up one buffing character compared with a big heavy fighting tank. I've also chosen not to include Forge World units in this, as we know that they're going to be updated in the near future, so while Relic Contemptor Dreadnoughts might still be some of the strongest units in the game, I feel like that's unlikely to be the case for long, and I think it's best to reassess once we actually have the Forge World indexes in hand. Please bear in mind that this is a fairly early impression of the units. We don't really have any substantial tournament data with the new Space Marine Codex yet, so this is largely going to be based on my own personal opinions. As always with these tier rankings, I'm sure that some of these won't be in the right place. If you think that anything is stronger or weaker than where I've put it on the list, then let me know down in the comments, and why you think that unit might be a bit overrated or underrated. With all that being said, we're going to jump into the lowest tier, which is tier 3. So first of all, I would like to say that even the units that I've ranked down in the lower tier of the army, for the most part still seem decently usable to me. Honestly, in the right circumstances, I could still see the vast majority of these being used in some sort of competitive list, but I just think for the most part they're not quite as optimal as other units within the decks. For units, I've chosen to put Assault Marines, Reavers and Scout Bikes here. Assault Marines just have very little reason to take them, while Vanguard Veterans exist. You pay 1 extra point for 1 extra attack, and that's an absolutely great deal. Plus, they don't compare amazingly well to Assault Intercessors, who are troops and have OBSEC. Reavers again just stack up fairly badly against other similar options. Again, you can get a Vanguard Veteran with a jump pack for just an extra point, and they still have deep strike, and extra movement and AP. Otherwise, I'd typically rather want to take some of the troops choices, particularly things like Intercessors or Incursors. Finally, Scout Bikes went up in points quite a lot, but didn't gain the extra wound that the regular bike squad did when it went up in points, so even with their increased damage dealing, I think they're hard to justify over regular bikers now. In terms of vehicles, I was umming and ahhing about the drop pod. I know I've written it down here, but I think in hindsight I would have put it up in tier 2. Drop pods are quite expensive at 70 points, and they do give you a big liability of allowing your opponent to wrap and trap them in combat, but being able to deep strike on the very first turn can let some very scary Space Marine units get to work early, so I certainly think it can be worth a premium in some circumstances. For the vast majority of cases though, if I was using deep strike, I'd typically want to be using something with innate deep strike, things like jump pack troops or terminators. After the Storm Speeders, I've chosen to put the Hail Strike down here. It's fairly flimsy at toughness 6 and 10 wounds for 150 points, and Space Marines just really aren't hurting for anti-infantry firepower. I think the Hail Strike in particular stacks up very badly compared with 2 Invader ATVs, who only cost a little bit more and have more firepower and far more durability. I've chosen to put the Repulsors down here as well. While they're still intimidating threats on the field, they are very points intensive, and now they can't get rerolls anymore, and lost various special rules such as Fly, their Repulsor field, and the Repulsor Executioner lost firing twice on its turret. I just really don't think they're all that strong per point anymore. There's still something to be said for having all that firepower in one big mass, but I just think that there's better shooting platforms in the Space Marine army now. Similarly, I've chosen to put the vast majority of ground-based tanks down here, including the Vindicator, Predators, Razorback and Land Raiders. They've all just really suffered from losing any access to rerolls, aren't really all that great for claiming objectives of opponents, and still kind of liable to being tied up. Out of these I have the most time for Vindicators and Razorbacks. Both of them are fairly cheap and do put out a reasonable amount of fire. Next we have one of the new Gladiators, the Gladiator Lancer, which I honestly think could be in the running for one of the weakest units in the Space Marine Codex. Its anti-tank laser destroyer does hit on 2s, but its actual damage profile is worse than a Predator Annihilator with 4 las cannons, despite costing a fair bit more. I really don't think that this guy has much of a place compared with the other variants. Next up we have the Whirlwind and Thunderfire Cannon, which I honestly couldn't have seen myself placing so low in the previous edition. Ignores line of sight firepower is absolutely great, but I feel that these guys are paying through the nose for it now. The Thunderfire Cannon's damage output is absolutely laughable, and I'd only really want to use it for tremor shells now, and the Whirlwind is just still very expensive for the damage that you deal. Both of them were further hampered in the new decks by not getting any rerolls anymore. Next we have the anti-air contingent, the Hunter and the Stalker. Both of the tanks are really quite durable point for point, but they just don't do all that much unless there happen to be flyers around. They do some anti-flyer fairly well, but not significantly better than other anti-tank weapons in the Space Marine army. and honestly I can't see people paying the premium for loads of anti-air units, particularly as we don't see all that many flyers around now. Talking of not seeing all that many flyers around, I've also chosen to put the Space Marine flyers down here as well. Again, I don't necessarily think they're bad per se. You get pretty reasonable firepower for the points that you invest, and it is quite useful to be able to jump them all over the board, but people do seem to be leaning away from flyers these days just because they don't really help out with objectives all that much, and because of that fast movement, they do tend to command some fairly hefty price tags. Finally for the list, I chose to put the Hammerfall bunker down here. I think that the thing's interesting, firing multiple heavy bolter shots at everything that it can see, but I think in real life it's going to be hampered by terrain, where you can deploy it, and the fact that it degrades really punishingly, so when it's bracketed it only hits on 5s. Potentially very very powerful in huge apocalypse style games, but not so great in your standard 2k match. So next up we come to tier 2 then. I've chosen to split tier 2 into 2 halves, a lower half and an upper half, and we'll start with the lower half first. First up, I've chosen to put Scout Squads and Landspeeder Storms in here. Scouts were definitely hampered by moving them to the elite slot, but they still remain quite an interesting unit to be able to deploy outside of your deployment zone and maybe steal an objective in the first turn of the game and provide a bit of screening. I think they're still good, but just a bit outshone by units like Incursors these days. While Landspeeder Storms might not do all that much in and of themselves, I think they could be interesting for objectives, having a super fast movement that can deliver a squad of scouts to hopefully steal an objective right from under the opponent's nose. I think they became a bit more interesting now the scouts can get out after it moved. I've chosen to put Devastator Centurions here, despite multiple nerfs, including loss of the core keyword, loss of bolter discipline for hurricane bolters, and also being fairly expensive. I think with their big multi-wound infantry that can strike at long range, they can still be interesting with some unit combos such as Apothecaries. You will be paying a lot per model, but if those models have a 6+ feel no pain, get healed wounds and can get set up for 1 command point per, then they could still be a really big problem. Certainly a lot weaker than they were before though. I've put 3 of the variants of Dreadnoughts here, the standard one, the Ironclad Dreadnought and the Contemptor here. All of these guys gain massively from gaining Duty Eternal on their profile, so they're now really quite durable compared with some other similarly priced tanks. I think in the game they're in a quite good place at the moment, having a bit of shooting and a bit of melee, allowing them to storm forwards and contest the midfield. Maybe just not quite as good as some of the other Dreadnoughts. Next up we have the Gladiator Reaper and Valiant. These guys are more expensive than the Lancer, but gain a lot more out of it I think, which I would say is their biggest weakness. They are really quite expensive, and if you lose them then you're losing a big investment. They also don't gain any rerolls due to not being core, so they do have to be carried by their raw firepower alone, but in fairness that is quite impressive. The Reaper can put out over 40 anti-infantry shots if it needs to, and the Valiant has 8 very decent anti-tank shots, so you can pretty much guarantee that they're going to get the job done for their respective roles. Next up we have Landspeeders, particularly the Landspeeder with a multi-melter is now a reasonably good choice. It's got very very good speed and decent damage output and reasonable durability point for point, though I still think it doesn't compare amazingly with some of the other platforms, things like ATVs and attack bikes. For the most part I think that the more heavily armed variants of Landspeeder, the Typhoon and Tornado, are probably just putting too many eggs in one fragile basket. Maybe could be interesting with some Ravenwing rules or something though. Finally, sticking with the Landspeeder theme, I've chosen to put the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike and Hammerstrike here. Again, both of these guys put out a very decent amount of anti-tank shots, and the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike hits on 2s as well, which is no bad thing. They're very fast, and again my main issue is durability. Toughness 6 and 10 wounds for around about 170 points really isn't all that great. If you can find a way to keep them alive though, then they'll certainly make their presence felt. So let's move on to the upper half of tier 2 then, and I've chosen to kick it off with Aggressors and Assault Centurions. I did a recent comparison video on the channel comparing them to Terminators, and in all honesty they do all have their advantages. Aggressors are a pretty decent hybrid, still throwing out a lot of bolt or flame shots at range despite the loss of their double shooting ability, and of course can still wreck tanks in combat. And in melee, particularly against heavies, there's very little competing with Assault Centurions. Their massive siege drills with no hit penalty are great, and with their flamers being 12-inch now, at 12-inch range they have absolutely awesome anti-infantry firepower. I think they do need some way to deploy them though, and I still think that Raven Guard is likely the way to go for them to get a deep strike from their stratagem. In any case, they're both threats that the enemy can't really ignore, although maybe not the most durable point for point. Next, I've chosen to include a bunch of the power armoured Space Marines that I think can all have their uses in a competitive army list, but just won't be played quite as much compared with their other counterparts. First we have Infiltrators, who pay a premium over Incursors for their deep strike denial bubble, which for me is the main reason to run them, though I think that people will tend to gravitate to the cheaper Incursors with the AP-1 combat blades myself. Tactical Marines are very cheap and very durable, though for objective camping you might want the extra range and punch of the bolt rifles that the Intercessors can get, and that honestly seems like a fairly reasonable upgrade for an extra point or two. Sternguard Veterans actually compare very favourably to Intercessors. The main issue is that they're not troops, so they won't help with OBSEC or filling detachments, and typically with Elite's choices you're going to want things that can deal heftier amounts of damage. And finally the Company Veterans, which are a very small and flexible unit, and can actually be quite handy for having that bodyguard rule to help keep characters alive. Next we have Outriders and Bike Squads, both of which I feel are fairly well balanced at the moment, and can be really quite helpful for including in a Space Marine list to go and grab objectives early in the game. They'll both do solid work against infantry, and are at least reasonably resilient to return enemy fire, having a good amount of toughness 5 wounds. In particular, Bike Squads are really quite tough per point now they're 3 wounds. Impulsors and Rhinos I think are both very solid transports at the moment, though they're maybe not quite cheap enough to see absolutely tons of them spammed. The Impulsor's good movement can be a genuine asset to certain Primaris units such as Assault Intercessors and Blade Guard Veterans, and the Rhino could be an interesting for a very cheap but very durable objective securing squad. Maybe think about loading up a bunch of cheap tactical marines in it and parking on an objective, and the opponent's going to have a lot of tough bodies to chew through before they can take it back. Next we have a whole bunch of Space Marine fire support units, Devastators, Hellblasters, Fire Strike Turrets, Eliminators and Suppressors, all of which I think have their own merits and could most certainly see play if you like their particular flavour of firepower. 2 Wound Devastators are very interesting. We could see them jumping out of drop pods with multi-melters perhaps, or even just sat at the back with las cannons seems like a reasonable choice. Assault Hellblasters look really interesting to me now. Putting out 3 overcharged plasma shots apiece is pretty scary. The Fire Strike Turret seems fairly decent for camping objectives with that long-range autocannon, and with a 2+ ballistic skill and 2+ save, it's fairly accurate and hard to shift. Eliminators will still do a very decent job of ruining the day of enemy characters. They have lost their excellent guided aim ability, but hitting on 2s to somewhat make up for that. And Suppressors can give you some infantry-based autocannon firepower, again a lot more interesting now they went to 3 shots each. Being able to ping a unit to prevent overwatch could also be useful too. Next up we have Inceptors, who I think are quite a good little durable, fast and problem-solving unit. A pretty handy one for just jumping down and destroying some enemy infantry units, and with the new points cost, their plasma weapons are looking quite interesting as well. Maybe not the absolute strongest firepower point for points, but the fact that they're fairly tough and can deploy it exactly where you need it is really quite handy. Next we have the Invicta Tactical Warsuit, which admittedly didn't gain core or any benefits from Duty Eternal, but its firepower did get slightly buffed, and it still remains a very very scary threat to be throwing right up in the front of the opponent's army, and it really does demand to be dealt with. It tends to be very swingy on first turn I find. It'll pretty much guarantee some dead enemies if you do have first turn. They will be pretty much guaranteed to get shot first if you don't. Finally I've put the Venerable Dreadnought here, who is much improved with Duty Eternal and retains a 6+ Feel No Pain and 2+ Ballistic skill. I think he's looking a lot more interesting now, whether he's being fielded as a hybrid melee fighter unit with twin lascannons, or if you're going for twin lascannons and a missile launcher and getting a bit of fire support on the go. This guy's really quite annoying to shift point for point. So now we come to the really big guns then. I think that the units in Tier 1 will certainly get included in multiple competitive lists. First up, I've included the Invader ATV and also the Attack Bike here. Invader ATVs are pretty well known how strong they are at the moment. You get a lot of wounds for your 80 to 85 points and some decent firepower too, whether you take the Melter or the Gatling. Again, they're pretty obnoxious when combined with an Apothecary, having a 6+ Feel No Pain, healing wounds, and also getting to set one up back up for 1 command point is ridiculously powerful. I think the Attack Bike might be going a bit under the radar in its shadow, but it is significantly cheaper, and while admittedly a fair bit less durable point for point, it has far better firepower. Honestly, they don't stack up all that badly against Eradicators, while being significantly more mobile, and when that happens you know that the unit's going to be strong. Attack Bikes also have the core keyword too, if you do want to go for some rerolls. Next we have Blade Guard Veterans, which are a unit that I think are quite hard to go too far wrong with in 9th. Those Storm Shields make them really durable per point, and Strength 5 Damage 2 Power Swords will pretty much put the hurt on anything. Extra nasty in armies such as Blood Angels and White Scars, but they can just be carried by their combat stats in basically any Space Marine force. I think it's going to be quite a common sight to see units of 5 of these jumping out of Impulsors. For another flavour of melee though, I think that Vanguard Veterans are now looking really interesting indeed. They essentially have the same stat line as Assault Intercessors, but they can take jump packs for just 2 points, and then can go to town with all manner of discounted power weapons, of which Lightning Claws look really good at the moment, and also perhaps mix in a Storm Shield or 2 to tank a little bit of high AP damage that comes in on the unit. They just seem pretty brutally efficient in melee at the moment, and I'm sure they'll be making their way into many competitive Space Marine lists. Next up, I've decided to include the 3 flavours of Terminators here, who honestly I thought were quite an interesting unit before, being able to deal a decent amount of ranged firepower with their storm bolters, before thoroughly wrecking something in close combat. Now for just the extra cost of a point or two, they've gone up to 3 wounds, and they're some of the tankiest units per point in the Space Marine army. I really like the chain fists on standard Terminators now, and chop straight through any power armour with their AP-4. The relic Terminators are interesting for certain combos, such as lightning claws and combi bolters, which can give you a very cheap and effective Terminator squad, and both flavours of assault Terminators, both with lightning claws and thunderhammer and storm shield, are looking really quite nasty too. They're maybe not quite as tanky point for point as Blade Guard, but I think that their niche is that they can innately deep strike, which is really handy for getting them into the fray. Next up in this tier, I've decided to include pretty much most of the Space Marine troops choices. Currently having a lot of power armoured bodies piling onto objectives is really quite a solid way to help win a game, and I think that the 3 flavours of Intercessors all have their own unique niche, whether you want maximal tankiness with the heavy Intercessors, a flexible combination of ranged tankiness and melee power with the standard ones, or to go all in on melee and bully forward with the assault Intercessors. They're all very solid and decently pointed, and it might depend more on what chaps you're playing as to which one you pick. For just 1 point more than a standard Intercessor, upgrading to Incursors is really interesting as well. Having a unit of durable Space Marine troops that you can throw down in the midfield to take objectives right from the start is really quite a good plan, and I can certainly see a unit or 2 of Incursors making their way into many lists. Finally, of course, we have the veteran Intercessors, which I think could be a reasonable trade-off compared with assault Intercessors if, say, you were putting them in an Impulsor and you wanted to give them the maximal amount of fightiness. The extra points for the extra attack could well be worth it. Finally, I've decided to include the Redemptor Dreadnought in this tier, which is looking just so much improved in the new Space Marine decks. Both versions of its Gatling cannon and its Macroplasma Incinerator all got better. It gained Duty Eternal for no real significant increase in points, which makes it loads more survivable. Its melee power got better against tanks and heavies, now it does D3 plus 3 damage in combat, and it managed to retain the core keyword on top of all that, so it can still get decent rerolls from captains and lieutenants. I think it's hard to go too far wrong with a couple of these guys with Gatling cannons or plasma, stomping up the midfield to take objectives and beat people up in close combat. So I was planning on putting Eradicators in tier 1, but I've honestly decided that the most undercosted unit in Codex Space Marines deserves a tier all of its own. So in tier Eradicator, we have the Eradicator squad. I think everyone knows just why these guys are so good at the moment. A couple of squads of 3 of these guys will put out 6 melter shots at 24 inches and have pretty much the most cost-effective anti-tank firepower in the entire game of 40k. That combined with being reasonably durable point for point in that Gravis armour, and being able to combine with certain chapters such as Salamanders for +1 to wound is really quite brutal. And these guys are just efficient at their job to the extent where they make many other options in the Space Marine army kind of redundant. I mean, you certainly could take a fire-strike turret with Last Talons, or a Devastator squad decked out with multi-melters, but point for point they're just not going to do as well as the Eradicators. I think it's been pretty obvious right from the start that they needed a points decrease if they want to be in line with the other units, as they're just a bit overpowered at killing enemy tanks. Having said all that, I certainly don't think that Eradicators are necessarily some sort of auto-win button. If you fight a mainly infantry-based foe, then they're not going to be all that great, and it is possible to outmaneuver them or screen them out, as they are quite slow-moving and don't have the most enormously long range in the world. Plus they're not exactly outstanding in melee either. They still very much take my prize for the strongest unit in Codex Space Marines right now though. So let me know what you think of this rough tier ranking down in the comments below. As I said at the start, I know it's fairly early days at the moment, and I'm sure they're going to be units that I'm either overrating or underrating. If there's anything that you've been finding particular success with, or is not living up to the hype, then please let me know down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly have plenty more coverage of the Space Marine Codex coming out over the next few weeks. At some point, hopefully I'll get around to doing a character version of the same thing. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, I'd just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which you can find down linked in the video description below. Making all of these YouTube videos does take quite a lot of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel Patreons get a few bonuses, such as being able to see videos early, regular votes on what sort of things come next on the channel, and also automatic entry to the channel's monthly prize giveaway with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.